Hi, welcome to my CruiseLab. I'm Alexis and I'm a professor of tourism specializing on cruises. Tourism is a global phenomenon and it's important, not just economically, but also culturally, psychologically and socially. At the same time, tourism is on the research on the cruise sector. I will not focus on the whole macroeconomic level of the outbreak and what this means for bookings and what this means for the longer term for the tourism industry in general and the cruise industry in particular. No, I want to focus on exactly what happens on board when an illness outbreak occurs and the people are forced to be stranded for a number of days on board a cruise ship. What are the dynamics that develop there? How do people interact with each other? And what can we learn out of this in order to better manage the crisis, also beyond the traditional emergency procedures and crowd-controlled measures that have been well established and arguably work pretty well in the cruise sector so far. So a couple of years ago, I did a bit of research by examining a number of cruise incidents, and believe you me, there are plenty of those where passengers end up in a kind of forced quarantine, a non-intentional quarantine on board the cruise ship. This could be either because of a loss of energy, it could be that came out of a fire, it could be a loss of propulsion, and a number of reasons which they have as a result that many passengers are stuck on board for a number of days and basically until the problem is solved. And this is very similar to the quarantine kind of situation we had with cruise ships. So what can we learn from this? By looking at my research, I tried to summarize a bit the main points and put it in a way and present it in a way which is easy and I would dare to say a bit entertaining to look at. If you want to look at more details and read the paper, I've put the links in the description of the video. You're very welcome to go click and download the whole thing. So let me begin with the whole idea about what is it that we should do when a crisis as such occurs and what's very important. So I would like to start with my two P's. Okay? P stands for principle. So no matter what crisis you have in your hands, if you do not have a concrete guideline or procedure for something, you need to actually improvise in the moment. And the question is, how do you improvise? This is where principles help. If you have a certain set of principles in place, then you can actually deal with unforeseen incidents within a crisis and perhaps react the right way. So the two principles here are people are more important than money. This may sound obvious, but when it comes to health and safety, and this is what tourism is about, a good holiday is, in every case, a safe holiday. If people don't feel safe, they will stay home. If people stay home, the tourist industry will have a problem. Okay? So it's important to put people first. And then the other aspect, the aspect of managing a crisis or an incident, is that truth is more important than liability. Those two, eventually, even after the crisis is over, there will be your reputation. And you cannot afford to lose this reputation, because if you lose credibility, if you lose your image as being a people business, simply because you care about people, then the whole thing collapses. So those two principles need to guide our entire efforts. Now, what are the rest of the ingredients? We have seen over the years that, a lot of incidents or even crises, it could be an outbreak, it could be a terrorist attack, eventually escalate. They escalate in the media and they end up becoming an economic crisis. They end up becoming a media crisis. And the role of communication is catalytic there. So what does that mean for actually managing an outbreak incident on board a cruise ship? Well, you need your 4 H's. What are the H's? Well, first of all, you've got to be hard with the facts. Getting the facts right is very important. We live in times where everyone is starting to become an expert in everything. And if you actually follow back the whole trail of different comments, like with the coronavirus currently, you would see it all actually boils down to a limited number of sources. Now, if one of those sources is wrong, it will come out. And your company cannot afford to be distributing information which is wrong. Obviously, going to another extreme, saying nothing and sharing no information whatsoever in order to avoid sharing wrong information is also obviously not the right thing. So you've got to be really, really hard with the facts. The second H we have here is honesty. Honesty. You have to say the truth. This is very much connected with this truth principle. There's nothing better in a crisis than the honest truth. We should trust people to deal with the truth, and if we trust them to deal with the truth, they will trust us to tell them the truth. And this is actually what enables a good flow of communication. And talking about the flow of communication brings me to my next H, which is hope. People isolated, people in quarantine, would want to maintain the connection to their relatives, to their loved ones, and vice versa. So it's essential during the times of crisis to establish a very clear communication channel between the people involved, the people afflicted from the crisis, and the people outside. More importantly, it's also relevant to make sure that the people on the inside see that the people outside are looking in. So visible external support is particularly helpful for the morale of the people caught in the crisis. And since we've talked about facts, then we come to my last H, which is help with interpretation. I've talked about so far about providing facts and being honest about them and enabling communication between the people involved in the outside world. Now, apart from the facts, we must be aware that, facts in themselves are not really interesting. The interpretations of the facts is what makes them interesting. And the thing is, if you do not help the people involved internally and externally to interpret the facts, they will interpret it on their own. And this interpretation, it can go in all kinds of directions, and it can be instrumentalized for individual different agendas. So being there first and providing help with interpretation is actually not a bad idea. So we've got the whole idea about communicating and managing the information within a crisis. Nevertheless, there are still people there on board, and there's still things going on. So how do we manage this? And for this, I've got my 3 I's. What are the 3 I's? The 3 I's are initiative, now, as mentioned earlier, a lot of our emergency procedures and crowd control protocols and measures, they work pretty well. The question is, what happens when a situation occurs which has not been defined? What happens with the existing guidelines and the existing procedures are not appropriate? What happens when the current model and what people have been trained for does not really help the situation? In this case, people have to improvise. So in order for people to improvise, they need to feel empowered to take an initiative. And this is particularly relevant for the crew. So in order to take initiative, they should feel that they can do something which is not defined without being scared of being punished afterwards for it. So empowering the crew to make decisions and innovate wherever possible during a crisis is not a bad thing. At the end of the day, let's not forget, procedures and protocols are there to serve people and not vice versa. This is why establishing those principles as a central guideline for managing a crisis on board is of particular importance. Okay? So, initiative. An additional aspect, my second I, is involvement. We know that in crisis situations, it might be a good idea to help people engage in problem-solving behavior, or coping behavior that's focused on problem solving. Because the alternative, emotional coping behavior, can often lead to, let's say, not particularly productive behaviors, such as a dramatization of the whole event, up to down really destructive behavior, which could result in conflicts or even panic. So by actually involving the passengers and the ones in the crisis, allowing them and organize them to contribute to the amelioration of the whole crisis is not just good in terms of dealing with the crisis itself, but it's actually good for the psychological well-being of the people involved. So, you know, if you make them part of the solution of the problem, you are reducing the probability that they actually start creating more problems for themselves and everyone else. And a place where involvement can really happen in a non-obstructive and yet constructive way would be my third E and last one, which would be investment or you can put improvement if you like, of life conditions on board. Now, this might sound counterintuitive because the last thing we think when we are talking about the crisis is actually having a nice life on board, like good food and good sleep and entertainment. Yes, nevertheless, we actually underestimate how important good food, good sleep, and physical exercise is for psychological well-being. So, within the limits allowed by the crisis, it does make a lot of sense to invest in actually providing the best living conditions and the best life possible for the people there. And that's not just about the passengers, it's also about the crew. You know, there's no harm, even in the middle of the crisis, to try and have a bit of a good life. And it actually helps deal with the crisis a lot better. So those are my 4 H's and my 3 I's, and this equation here is what will allow us to have the competence in order to deal with the coronavirus by providing confidence in the long term. So we have competence for confidence against the corona crisis. And those are our 4 C's. So, this is my proposal, and this is what I mentioned in the paper. Now, it has been developed in the past for different kinds of crisis. Nevertheless, a quarantine, whether involuntary or voluntary or induced, is still a similar situation. And you know, at the end of the day, this kind of scenario where people are actually stuck in a small location or in a small venue for a while is not just unique to the cruise industry. It could happen to a hotel, it could happen even in an airplane. So the question is, how do we deal with it? Now, maybe this could be a useful guideline. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll be back soon. Thank you very much.